You're good.
Dr. Alden Griffith got his doctorate at Wesley College right here in Massachusetts. Doctorate, sorry. He did his undergrad, two different colleges.
Wesleyan.
Wesleyan.
Which is really confusing.
And then UC Santa Cruz.
Yeah.
Went on to do a doctorate here in Massachusetts at Wellesley College, where he currently teaches. He's a assistant professor there of environmental studies, but it's not kind of just generic box environmental studies. He was sharing a story about his coursework, how he really likes to get into resource use and conservation and kind of different aspects of environmental studies. So sounds like a very passionate teacher, and I'm really looking forward to his talk tonight. A lot of biological interactions and different effects, how they affect plant populations. So please welcome Dr. Griffith as he talks about bridging ecological scales through demography.
Thanks so much. One second. Realizing that my computer wants to update, of course.
Uh-oh.
Here we go. Okay, we got it. Well, thanks for the invitation. I wanted to start by going back to when I first started getting into ecological research. I was in a laboratory in graduate school that was primarily focused on physiological ecology, which I really enjoyed, although most of my research ended up being focused on demography. So I was sort of living in two different worlds a little bit, measuring a lot of rates of photosynthesis and water status of plants, and then measuring the survival and growth of plants in different systems. And always sort of wanting to know, well, how does the rates of photosynthesis actually affect the rates of survival and growth, and how does that affect the population? So I was sort of wanting to connect these two ecological scales, so to speak. And I'm going to be thinking a lot about, or talking a lot about, different scales, and it's just important to maybe be explicit about that. I mean, we always think about time and space as important and sort of more obvious scales, but the organizational scale in biology is also a critically important one. This is maybe a bit more conceptual because it's not necessarily strictly easily defined, but this idea that we've got molecular and cellular processes that influence individuals, and then we can think of populations as being a collection of individuals, sometimes easily defined, sometimes hard to define, right? And then communities of organisms and ecosystems. And in the last few decades, there's been a lot more focus on realizing that if we're focused too much on any one particular scale, we might be missing the big picture or properties that emerge as you go across scales. Some important scaling tools in biology that we can maybe immediately turn to, probably the biggest one, maybe the biggest discovery and sort of foundational sort of key of the 20th century is understanding DNA, right? And really linking what's going on in broad evolutionary scales to molecular and cellular processes. I mean, this was a huge key that unlocked the ability to scale across lots of systems in biology and make sense of a lot of things in one unified framework. Mass and energy is another great scaling tool, and so in physiological ecology, you can, if you know the rates of photosynthesis with assumptions, you can kind of try and scale that up and think about what that implies for whole ecosystems, and really try and get a sense of how processes at one scale map onto processes potentially at the global scale. Right? And so I want to present what I'm calling a gross oversimplification here, but I think this is sort of a useful way of thinking about other frameworks for thinking about how we could scale. So just like any science, ecology is, in some respects, driven by theory, right? That's pushing us forward and making predictions that we can go out and test in the field. And often, a way of doing that is to to test predictions by hypothesis testing, by looking, for within the framework more or less of sort of yes, no, is this supported or not? And that has its limitations. Another alternative, and maybe not mutually exclusive, though, is trying to actually parameterize theoretical models with empirical data, actually trying to not just test predictions, but actually play those theories out with data collected in the field. And I think this gives us a lot more opportunities for scaling, for trying to link across different aspects of ecology. So I'm going to make the pitch that I think demography and population ecology presents a really great scaling opportunity. So demography being essentially kind of the fates of individuals, or the survival and growth and reproduction of individuals. And demography as a tool always has been a scaling tool. It scales from individuals to population processes. We can measure a whole bunch of individuals and then know a lot about what the population is going to do, whether it's going to go up or down, et cetera, and why. And a few colleagues of mine and I argued recently that and maybe just because we're all demographers, but that arguably populations and demography kind of sit in the middle of a lot of scales. It's between organisms, individual organisms and communities. These processes often are not happening on the scale of seconds, but often take years, et cetera. And the spatial scale obviously can depend on a lot of things, but it seems like a potentially really useful way to scale across a bunch of different axes. It kind of sits in the middle. So, why demography other than maybe it's sitting in a good space to scale? One is thinking about ecological forecasting. I'll show you some examples in a little bit. This is a lot more important nowadays, I think we can argue, than maybe it has been in the past with global change, trying to make predictions of what ecological communities are going to do in response. So we might be interested in things like changes in community composition or species ranges or population viability. In demography, the fates of individuals underlies all of this. Right? And underlying that are things like environmental drivers, could be climate, could be soil conditions. We can also think about functional traits that might be easier to measure than some other aspects of demography, as potentially thinking about how these traits might inform larger scale outcomes at the population or community scale. We can also think about this with respect to evolution or eco-evolutionary processes, and you could arguably, evolution is fundamentally a demographic process, right? It has everything to do with survival and reproduction of organisms and how that's linked to traits and to the environment. And there's a great paper by Jess Metcalf with a great title, Why Evolutionary Biologists Should Be Demographers, just sort of trying to remind everybody that, let's not lose sight of the fact that this is playing out in ecological systems with the demography of the individuals. Right? So, with this in mind, I want to sort of give one example of particularly important theory and how we can start to try and parameterize the theory and see how it plays out in the field. So probably one of the most unifying, still debatable and contentious theories in ecology is that of the ecological niche, formulated by Hutchinson in the mid-20th century. This really cuts across all of ecology. Right? It's really about describing the range of abiotic and biotic factors in which a species or population can persist. So classic ways of thinking about it have to do with sort of different resources or conditions, and the space within those, along these axes. This could say for plants could be pH, and this could be soil moisture or something. And you can map different species into that space. Has huge implications for species coexistence and competition. You can also think about it with multiple resources. Right? It's a very flexible theory and drove a lot of 20th century ecological thinking and has faced a lot of challenges recently, but actually more recently, I feel like it's starting to come back more into favor. But importantly, this is a huge scaling theory, right? It implicitly or explicitly, incorporates the environment, the fates of individuals, populations, and ultimately has huge implications for communities and coexistence of species together. And this is often sort of considered to be really foundational community ecology, but it's ultimately demographic. It's ultimately about the persistence of populations. And it came out of a symposium, or was originally presented at a symposium on populations and demography. Right? So our sort of main metric is, will a species persist, or will a population persist? And that's a demographic question. So this is a great quote from a paper by Jeff Dietz that came out recently. He says, part of the challenge to quantifying the niche, they use slightly different wording because they're focusing on something very specific, but that's largely what he was talking about. Part of the challenge to quantifying the niche arises from a gulf between the neat conceptual and mathematical constructs of niche theory and the inherent variability of field studies of population dynamics. That, like, things look very nice and neat on paper, right? And you can have an elegant theory that makes a lot of sense, but it's really hard to actually see that play out and quantify that in the field. But what was really exciting about this paper for me when I saw this was like, oh my goodness, they're actually doing this. They're really looking at the niche from a persistence demographic perspective in the field. And it's, it only took 65 years, right, or more, something like that, to really do this. At least in a way that I thought was very compelling. So what they did, they were looking at this orchid, Goodyear pubescens down in Georgia, I think. And they sampled 6 different populations over 6 years, a huge effort, demographic data for nearly 2,000 plants, tracking survival and growth, reproduction. And what they did is combined this with information about soil moisture and light availability. These are just standardized units, but increasing this way is wetter soils, and increasing this way is brighter environments. And they incorporated both environmental variables and demographic variables into a single quantitative model to look at the probability of population persistence, which is what the colors are here. So this one would be the model suggesting 100% probability of persistence. Right? So this is a real description of a niche for the species based on data collected in the field, expressed in the units of population persistence. And what's really interesting, they've got 2 populations here that seem to be sitting right squarely in the niche in good habitat, right? But also some populations over here that are in poor habitat, basically have a low probability of persistence. So over in the green, this is sort of like 40% probability of persisting, right? And an important thing about this too is we often assume that plants, when we find a plant somewhere, that it's maybe decent habitat. And there's lots of reasons to think that plants are often not in ideal habitats, right? And a lot of ecological forecasting is based on finding species in a particular habitat and assuming, therefore, that that's decent habitat for them. Right? So this is a very different way of trying to get at this question of the niche, and one I find really compelling. But what about applied questions? So an important aspect or an important way that scaling is brought to bear with applied questions in conservation has to do with, or at least an example would be, how good are population forecasts when disconnected from processes happening at other ecological scales? So conservation biology has been greatly informed by population models and demography. It's been a key tool, but we use models of what's been happening now or in the last few years, and that's kind of all we have to make assumptions about what might happen in the future. And we say, well, if everything stays the same, this is the trajectory, right? But Elizabeth Crone, who's now here at Tufts, she and a whole bunch of other collaborators published a paper explicitly trying to test this, like how good are our models at projecting forward? And so they asked the question, can population models based on recent empirical data actually predict growth rates in the future? So they pulled together 82 different populations in different studies that were sampled quite well with at least 4 years of demographic data. And then they compared the model population growth rates and looked to see how they matched up to observed population growth rates at least 5 years later. So these are studies where they were able to find data that were used to model, and then people who had came back at least 5 years later to see what the population growth rates were in the future. And so what we're going to look at is a few figures that compare the model population growth rate on this axis to the observed future growth rate. And if the models are doing really well, we'd expect it to be along the 1-to-1 line here, and anything down here would be modeled overestimating the population growth rate, which would be really problematic in a conservation sense, that you're saying that it's doing better than it actually ended up doing. And this is what they found. All of those dots there are the different studies. There's like absolutely no correlation at all. Basically, like our population models have nothing to say about what's going to happen in the future of these for these populations, which is a little distressing. And I wouldn't say it's surprising. Nobody's claiming that they're able to predict the future, but we kind of make decisions kind of thinking that it might inform the future at least. And what they think is the biggest cause of this is that we're not taking into account other factors, other interacting species, other environmental drivers. We're not connecting the population to anything else. Right? So with this type of sort of thinking in mind and this kind of research gaining momentum, a few colleagues and I organized a symposium 2 years ago in Sheffield, England with the British Ecological Society, which was in like the most grand room I've ever been in. There's portraits of Queen Victoria and the Duke of Wellington? Probably, yeah.
There's also a giant knife made with, like, they add a new blade to it every year.
Yeah, so it was a very intimidating room to be in with all these portraits around it. But it was basically trying to bring people together who were using demography to ask a whole range of different questions, not just about population. We were addressing questions about evolution, about disease, about communities, about the influence of climate, et cetera. And we also pulled together a journal special feature from this to publish articles in all of the different journals of the British Ecological Society to really show like what the reach of demography is. And this paper by Ewan Erlin is addressing this gap that Elizabeth Crone pointed out, that we don't connect population models to environmental drivers. And luckily, though, that is increasing. This is the number of studies that they find that actually incorporate environmental drivers into population models. And these could be factors such as herbivory or disturbance, competition, climate, et cetera. So we're getting better at starting to incorporate these things in, and by incorporating them, we can maybe have a bit more predictive power going forward. If we know something about the effect of herbivores or the effect of climate, right, that's going to improve our forecasting. Another really interesting example is a paper by Maria Uriarte and colleagues. They have this massive data set from Costa Rica with these giant 1-hectare plots in several different forests where they have almost 10,000 trees and 171 species over 7 to 12 years. And what they were looking at, they measured temperature and water stress in these plots over time. They measured changes in traits such as specific leaf area, which is the mass of leaves divided by the area, and it's has important implications for rates of photosynthesis and respiration, and wood density, which has important implications for dealing with water stress, but also potentially limiting growth rates. And they were looking at how this affects tree growth and survival, but also how it's mediated through these different traits. And they're able to combine this into a simulation model that what this is on the left here, this is looking at the total basal area of these forests. These are different secondary forests, so they all are at different ages, the different stands, and comparing them to old growth forests. And the regions that are sort of shaded, these are the modeled simulation based on all the data they collected, compared to the actual observed trends. So these are the secondary forests increasing in area over time. These are changes in the specific leaf area, so this trait, which is being predicted by the model. And you can look at this, and it's totally not perfect. This one forest grew where the model said it was not likely to. But all in all, I'm actually kind of amazed about this. This is not something we've been really good at doing with ecological systems. They're really noisy. They're really challenging to predict. And to be able to just take measures of or to predict the outcome of a forest with some degree of accuracy using climatic drivers and starting points is like, wow, that's not too bad. So we're really making progress in this area. So I brought all of these up to just sort of highlight that this way of thinking about how populations and demography may connect to other aspects of ecology has been an important driver in my thinking in the last few years, and underlies a lot of what I've been doing. So I want to talk a bit about work that I'm doing in my lab currently, and we'll sort of see how much time we have, et cetera. There's 3 things I was hoping to talk about, but we'll, depending on the sake of time, we may jump around a little bit. But the current projects I want to talk about, one is a study that is sort of mature at this point, or at least the first part of it. The data has all been collected, and so we're hoping to submit it pretty soon. This is a study that focuses on a question related to soil resources and ecosystem invasibility. So the ability of a new species or invasive species to invade a system. And a question there would be, what drives the success or failure of novel plant populations? And that's a big question that's been addressed in a lot of different ways over the years. A second topic is looking at plant facilitation in alpine systems. So another way of framing that is, does habitat provided by other plant species facilitate the persistence of populations at high elevation? So there's been a lot of work in plant facilitation, but much less so through a demographic perspective. So there's lots of evidence that plants can benefit other plants in certain environments, but how does that scale up to whether the population is going to persist or not? And then lastly, this is a brand new project that I'm just starting, so I don't have too much to talk about other than the questions that I'm interested in. But I'm really interested in exploring the ecological niche of Alaria petiolata, or garlic mustard. I'm sure you're all familiar with that species. And a bunch of questions are within this new study. So one has to do with the ability of existing plant communities to resist invasion, and how that is mapped onto resources and the niche of garlic mustard. And then what is the breadth and variability of garlic mustard's niche in its invasive range? And then how do environmental conditions influence the outcome of species competition and coexistence? So this is sort of a larger question being addressed with a specific system here. So this study, I want to first acknowledge my collaborators, Vicki Rogers at Babson College and Jeff Dukes at Purdue, although he used to be at UMass Boston when he started up this facility. So this question is really getting at, or this study is really getting at the question of what determines invasion, establishment, and community invasibility. And if any of them has ever written invasibility before, you will notice that word autocorrects it every time to invisibility. It's not made the dictionary yet, but anyhow. There's a lot of theories trying to explain the success or failure of plant invasions, and it would kind of be silly to think that one of them is correct. They're not mutually exclusive. But this is a theory provided by Mark Davis now 17 years ago, called the theory of fluctuating resource availability, and it is really explicitly for plants. And it provides a nice general framework for thinking about plant invasions, and the idea is based on the availability of resources. And resource availability can be determined by resource supply, so there could be an increase in resources, but just functionally the same, there could be a decrease in resource uptake by the plant community. Right? So if there's a disturbance that knocks back your competitors, that might be functionally the same as having more resources added to the community, because now you have less of them being taken up. And the idea is that down in this corner, where you have more resources and fewer of them being taken up, you would expect a system to be more invasible. So the idea is broad, but how it plays out is a bit more tricky potentially. And there's been studies that have shown support for this, but other studies that have shown mixed support. But I wouldn't necessarily expect this to always be the case in every situation anyhow. So this study was conducted at the Boston Area Climate Experiment right up the road in Waltham. This facility's been around since 2007, and it consists of these greenhouses, or greenhouse-like structures. They're open on the sides, and in most cases on the top. And there's a drought treatment that is provided by plastic panels that cover 50% of the roof. So they capture 50% of precipitation. They then channel that off into tanks that then get sprinkled onto other plots that then get 150% of the precipitation. So we have these nice 3 treatments, and it's been going on since 2007. So these communities are really sort of existing in different climate regimes. So I want to map this experimental design onto the theoretical model by Davis. So with our 3 treatments, we have our ambient precipitation. We've got plots that get 150% and then 50%. And this is really our ecosystem resource supply axis that we're manipulating. And we're manipulating resource uptake by clipping neighboring plant vegetation, so non-target species away, right? And so these are the controls where we leave the vegetation intact, or we clip neighboring plant species away. So we're trying to fill this space with experimental treatments. And over in this corner, we would expect these would be more invasible. So we're thinking about this with respect to invasive species, and stages of invasion are important to think about. There's species that might be good at being transported, species that might be good at spreading across the landscape. We're really focusing on this initial stage of establishing can a plant population withstand abiotic and biotic conditions to establish. So we're looking at the environmental drivers, how that influences individual plants, and what the overall population level outcome is. We use Persicaria lapathifolia, formerly Polygonum lapathifolia. This isn't really an invasive plant, although we would never have been able to do this study if we asked to invade this site with some aggressive invader. There's lots of other researchers working there. So really you can think of this as we're introducing a new species to the system that's not at this site. So it's functionally the same question. So we set up 144 relatively small plots. Granted, this is a relatively small plant, at least it certainly can be. Some of them get kind of big. And invaded them with seeds each year, 2 years. We had different plots each year, so we weren't invading again. We're invading separate plots. And overall, we had pretty variable seedling establishment with a maximum maybe 15% or so. Over the 2 years, we followed about 2,000 individual plants that we marked and measured for size, survival, and seed production. I should mention this is an annual plant. We measured a lot of environmental and physiological data. I'm mainly going to talk about soil moisture here. All of this is sort of our next step. So we're sitting on a bunch of data. And the plots were set up slightly differently in the 2 years. We learned a little bit after the first year. So the first year we just put up plots out, and we had a decent amount of herbivory in 2013. And in the next year we wanted to add some soil moisture sensors in there, which is a pretty decent investment. And we didn't want all of our plants being eaten if we spent a lot of money to measure them. So we decided to also build cages around plots to exclude herbivores. And this ended up being really fortuitous for kind of a different reason, which I'll talk about. We also ended up adding a summer drought relief. We noticed that in 2013, there's a lot of reasons why we thought the plants were in the drought plot were actually doing quite well if only they could be relieved from drought later in the season. So we added in this extra treatment. And you can conceptually think about our population model. This is what we were really following. We looked at germination and establishment, the growth from spring to early summer, and then early to late summer, and then the production of seeds in the fall. And underlying all this is demographic data that goes into a quantitative model. And in the between the fall and the spring, all we see is a distribution of sizes and probabilities of plants coming up. From spring to early summer, we have a lot of things going on. We have survival that's dependent on size. In this case, this is showing larger plants surviving. We have growth, so this is spring size predicting early summer size. So large plants in this case tend to be large. And then we also allowed for some secondary establishment later in the season, which turned out to be not all that important. Late in this season, in the midsummer, we've got a survival model as well and a growth model. And then late in the season, we have final survival and seed production model. So all of these go together into a population model to try and understand the overall population dynamics. So I'm going to show you results that are going to be sort of mapped onto this space. So just sort of remember that down in this corner is high invasibility and up here is low invasibility. And I'm going to show you distributions of population growth rates. So on the x-axis is the log of the population growth rate. And this is sort of what they'll maybe look like if the fluctuating resource hypothesis is supported, such that anything shifted over to the right is a higher probability, or the probability distributions of growth rates are higher compared to down here, where we've got competition with neighbors and drought conditions where it's shifted lower. So this is sort of what we're looking at, the shifts in the distributions of the population growth rates on the x-axis there. So these are all of our data, and that's a lot to look at. So I'm going to sort of walk you through and highlight different components of this. So if we look just in 2013, highlighted in blue, this is exactly what we thought would happen, basically. That anytime we either added resources or took away neighbors, or added resources and took away neighbors, population growth rates shifted over to the right. In the situations where it was dry conditions with neighbors, these plots basically completely uninvadable in 1 year. There's like nothing left. Right? So it's a really strong effect that was in line with the fluctuating resources hypothesis. But what's interesting is that it wasn't consistent through all of the different demographic sort of pathways in the life cycle. It wasn't that everything was always better for when you're in the wet and clipped. And it's sort of the power of this approach, is to be able to figure out what was driving this. So these are models underlying the overall outcome. So this is just looking at survival and growth as a function of size during the midsummer. These are wet and ambient plots. And so this is, as the plants get larger, the probability of surviving goes up. And the thin blue lines represent sort of equally likely outcomes. So it sort of gives you a sense of what the most likely outcome is when they're all clustered around here. This is size change, so anything above the dotted line is growth. So larger plants tend to grow larger, and then wet and ambient, they grew even larger. They got bigger. But for drought during the midsummer, the vital rates, the growth and survival, don't look all that different. If anything, the survival of large plants is actually a little higher. They're not growing maybe as much, but they're not like really suffering here. Everybody's sort of performing okay. If we look later at the end of the summer, this is late survival, survival to set seed. Everything's a bit messier here because this is an annual, so we're like getting fewer and fewer plants as everything dies. So we have lower sample sizes towards the end of the season. But the take home here is that in the drought condition, only the largest plants really survived. The small plants had a very low probability of surviving, and there was almost a complete reproductive failure. That you had to be really large to really make any seeds. Here's maybe a large plant maybe making 10 seeds, whereas large plants up here were making thousands of seeds. Right? It was a huge difference that contributed to the overall population differences. And so we see results consistent with the fluctuating resource hypothesis in that increasing resource supply or decreasing uptake led to increased invasibility, but importantly through different demographic pathways. With drought changing the supply of resources, we see late season low survival and really a reproduction failure that was the main cause. Right? And it happened to be a pretty dry summer. But for the rest of the growing season, drought plants were doing pretty well. I didn't show you data for clipping, but clipping, the effect of clipping was only through growth. It didn't change survival at all. Right? So these different axes have different demographic implications. So if we look now at what happened in 2014 compared to 2013, there's a pretty dramatic change. So this is 2014 plots that were out in the open, exposed to herbivory. And I'll just put arrows in here to get a sense of what's going on. All of the ambient and wet plots were worse. The population growth rates were shifted much lower, yes, this way, much lower down. The communities were much less invasible. But it was the exact opposite for the drought plots, the dry plots. They were shifted much more positively. So what is going on here? Well, one thing that we noticed in 2014, just while we were out there, is that the plants were being eaten like crazy. There was a lot more herbivory. So it turned out to be really good that we put cages out there to protect our plants, but it also gave us a way to examine the effect of herbivory. That wasn't actually our goal, and it turned out to be really important. So if we look now at 2014 plots compared to the ones that were protected from herbivory, so these are the ones that are out in the open. These are the ones that are caged. Everything is is shifted much more to the right. Populations are doing much better. And it turns out there's a really complicated effect of herbivory, soil moisture, or precipitation treatment, and plant size. So this is a very sort of messy figure here, but we're just going to look at two lines on here. What this is showing the survival and size changes based on early summer. So this is early summer size, big plants and small plants, and the survival to late summer. And this is early summer size, and then the late summer size. Right? So if we look just at the thick lines, which are plants growing in the wet plots, when they're caged, which are the pink lines up here, they're doing really well. The ambient plots and the wet plots, when they're protected from herbivores, they're behaving like we would expect with the fluctuating resource hypothesis. They're doing quite well. The big plants are growing really big. However, it completely flips around in the presence of herbivores. And now the plants that are in the wet treatments that have high soil moisture are doing the worst, especially the large plants. Large plants ended up having like a probability of survival around 20%, and they were just being eaten, and in some cases just disappeared. And if they were eaten, they then shrank. So anything down in this gray area here means plants that are shrinking. So we had these large plants that were just decimated and became effectively tiny plants. So effectively, the drought treatment offered protection from herbivory. And it could either be because the animals didn't like the habitat in the droughted areas, or because the plants weren't as juicy or something, right? But they were targeting the wet plants. So there's this really complicated interaction between size, moisture, and herbivory that makes predictions of this theory really tricky in the presence of herbivores. Right? And then the last thing to point out here, in 2014, we decided to add drought relief. So starting in the middle of the summer, we added water to our droughted plots to just help them out a little bit. And that's what these are over here. And these ended up being some of the highest growth rates of all, almost the most invasible, were the droughted plots that were then relieved from drought. So these are communities that had been droughted since 2007, and then have a year where they're relieved from drought. And so our idea is that these communities are less able to resist invasion because they're less vigorous communities after a decade of drought, basically. But if you remove the drought, then the invasive plant is able to come in. So some key take-homes from this study is that we do see support for the fluctuating resource hypothesis, but it's driven by distinct demographic pathways. It's not always that drought is always bad and wet is always good. It has different implications for different parts of the life cycle. But then importantly, strong herbivory can completely flip the demographic response. So this can have really important considerations with respect to spatial heterogeneity. If you have patches of dry versus wet areas, et cetera, right, you can end up having the opposite of what you expect from this theory. But also this idea that drought history may promote invasion if there's drought relief. And this is something that I was intrigued with several years before, and kind of excited to come back to this idea that there can be memories in the community, right? The community effectively, you can't ignore the fact that it's been droughted for the previous almost decade, right? That's going to influence its outcome. Let me just check my time here. All right. So one thing that we added in the cage plots is we put soil moisture probes in there. So I've been showing you guys just dry, ambient, and wet, which is a bit limiting. It's better than not having any information about environmental drivers. But by having moisture probes in the plots, we were able to track the moisture content throughout the season. These are the periods when we sampled. Each of the lines represents a single plot, and you can see how they all start off with about the same moisture, and then the drought plots dip down during the summer. This gives us much more power to say this level of moisture was associated with this demographic response. And so this allows us to make models that directly incorporate soil moisture as a continuous variable. So this is just an example of each of the dots here represents an individual plant. These are plants that lived, these are plants that died. And this is going from early summer to late summer, and with axes of the size of the plant, which is pretty much always important, and then soil moisture, which turns out to be really important too. And so down here we've got really small dry plants, and the probability of surviving is extremely low. This sort of this surface is the model. That's the prediction of survival based on conditions of moisture and size. And so for a small plant, its chances of surviving increase dramatically with soil moisture. Right? The effect of soil moisture is not nearly as important for large plants. They're able to weather the storm a bit more. So this is a similar type of figure for growth, where the effect of moisture is not as important. Basically, in order to grow, the bigger you are in the late summer is mostly dependent on how big you were early summer, but soil moisture plays a bit of a role too. So what this allows us to do is do basically the analysis that I showed you earlier for the orchid, where we can look at the probability of persistence along different axes that we might consider niche axes. So this is for these plants at the Boston area climate experiments for Persicaria pathifolia. This is axis of summer volumetric soil moisture, and then this is total mineral nitrogen, so nitrate and ammonium. And what's really neat about this is we're able to explore what's known as the fundamental niche by removing the plants around it. So this is, in the absence of competitors, what's the probability of persistence for the species, versus in the presence of competitors, how is this species constrained? Right? And we see that when it's growing all by itself, it tends to do better with high soil moisture, and it's not that, soil nitrogen isn't that big of a deal. Right? It's much more driven by soil moisture. At low soil moisture, it drops off radically in terms of the probability of persistence. In the presence of other plants, though, it's a very different landscape, and the probability of persistence ends up being down in this corner where you have higher nitrogen and low soil moisture. And importantly here, this type of outcome would be predicted in the sense that you can find plants growing in a habitat that's not their preferred habitat, but that's the space where they can grow in the presence of other plants. Right? That it doesn't prefer low soil moisture, it just might be able to cope with it better than the plants it's growing with, et cetera. Right? So this type of analysis is something we got very excited about, although I don't put much weight in this particular analysis because we weren't designing the study to do this. We did not sample very broadly throughout different levels of soil moisture and soil nitrogen. So this is sort of more of an exercise that, yes, we can do this, but a lot of this is sort of extrapolations for values for which we didn't have direct measurements. But this is something that's really motivating my next project that I'm really excited about. So I want to shift gears a bit and talk about facilitation in alpine systems. This is a side project that was started 6-ish years ago now, and comes from work I did in graduate school focusing on facilitation, and I've always been sort of fascinated by that and wanted to maintain a line of work in that area. This is work I've been doing out in Montana in Glacier National Park, and we're working up literally on the top of a mountain, trying to determine whether habitat provided by other plant species is, how significant is that in the persistence of populations? What's the overall role that it plays? So plant facilitation is something that has gained a lot of attention in the last few decades. The latter part of the 20th century for ecology was really kind of driven by competition. But facilitation started to gain sort of a bigger role, especially being incorporated into theories that have relevance for structuring plant communities. This is the number of publications that basically have something to do with plant facilitation. And it's been rising. Granted, publications in general have been rising. But within these 2,000 articles that have something to do with facilitation, these are all of the studies that have actually used a demographic or population modeling approach to try and figure out from the field what's the population persistence or the impacts for the population. So this really seems to be an area of a research gap that we're not scaling these effects up to the level of the population. So our sites are at the southeastern edge of Glacier National Park, near Two Medicine Lake, if anyone's ever been there. I don't think this mountain actually even has a name. There's Mount Henry, and this is Scenic Point. It's a gorgeous spot. And I've been lucky enough to be able to bring students with me every summer, which has been really fun, great opportunities for them to get out there. And these are students from this past year. They were like champs. They were amazing. We have to hike up to the top of the mountain every day to sample, and I was lagging behind them. So maybe that tells something about me. But up in this system, it's a really kind of simple system in that you have a lot of bare rock with hardly any soil, and then you have all these patches of plants growing together. So just to give you an example, this is a sort of color enhanced photo, so you can really see those green patches. You really have these clumps. It's like little islands in the sea of not very good habitat. And this idea has been around for a long time, that there are these islands that develop, and that you can't have soil without plants in the first place, kind of a chicken or the egg thing. So the plants are helping to promote the soil and keep organic matter and nutrients there. Right? So these plants are effectively facilitating each other by helping to maintain the conditions for plants. These are transects that we did this past summer, looking at the overall cover there. So this is going across 50 meters. Each little green line represents a spot of vegetation. So this little bit right over here is literally this patch of vegetation of several species in there. So it's really, really patchy and really, really generally low cover. Actually, I'll focus on our species in one second, but I just want to highlight the diversity that you can see there. I counted, I think, 9 different vascular plants in here, just quickly from the photograph, and that's an area about like this big. So you have these little pockets that are like pretty diverse. And what's amazing, we've got Campanula rotundifolia growing up in the top of this mountain, and it's growing on Wellesley's campus. I'm like, how does this plant do it? But we are focusing on this plant, Smilowskia calycina, which is a little mustard. And we sort of largely chose it because it's widely distributed up there, and it's also sort of amenable to demographic sampling. It's not necessarily a species that we were interested in because of anything in particular. We just wanted to really look at a population growing up there that we could sample. So we have 8 demographic plots up on this mountain, and we categorize plants based on microhabitat. So we're not doing any manipulations there, at least not yet. And we've marked plants and indicate whether they're growing with neighbors around them. Doesn't matter what type of species they're growing with, or whether they're growing alone. Here's plant 189. This is about the size of a dime. So this is the plant right here. It's a really tiny one. And we now have 4 annual transitions, so we've got good data. The first year we didn't get really good data, we're just sort of figuring things out. And we have, depending on the year, anywhere between 150 and about 200 individuals. And we measure the size as the volume of above ground biomass. That's our metric. And what's nice about this plant is the reproduction is quite easy to measure. You can count the fruits, and there's usually 1 to 2 seeds per fruit. And so you can get a nice estimate without destroying the plant. And also, even when the seeds disperse, you can see the outline of a fruit that was there, right? So it leaves evidence, and you can get data on reproduction. Here's a nice inflorescence. So just really quickly, I want to show you what these plants look like in terms of their survival, their growth, their probability of flowering, and the fruit production. This is size, so technically this is, I think it's the log volume in centimeters cubed. But these are bigger plants, and these are smaller plants. Survival is incredibly high. We almost never see mortality out there. This is a plant that just hangs on. These are all the individuals that we've ever seen die, and we have no way to say that there's a size effect or a neighbor or a lone effect, and so we just say survival is the average, which is 0.985. So they're really good at surviving. That's sort of their main strategy. For growth, the different lines here are the predictions for the, each line is represents a year, and these are plants growing alone versus plants growing with neighbors. These are the raw data here. And plants don't tend to change much in size from year to year. This is the average, and it's basically right on the sort of one-to-one line. They grow a little bit every year on average, but not much. Probability of flowering, it's very size dependent, so only the large plants tend to flower in a given year. But you can see, if anything, the plants growing by themselves, so not potentially being facilitated, have a higher probability of flowering than plants growing alone. Than plants growing with neighbors. And then for those that do flower, the fruit production can be highly variable from year to year. Some of the highest fruit production we've seen has been plants growing by themselves. So putting all of this together, we can get at questions about the entire population, but you might ask about seedling establishment. That can be rather important, right, to complete the life cycle. Unfortunately, we have almost no information about this. It's really hard to observe, and it's hard to even tell which species is which when they're that small. But the nice thing is, this is the only part of the life cycle that's missing. So we can effectively sort of ask questions about what would germination need to be in order to explain the patterns that we see. So we use integral projection models, which are the same type of population model we used before with the study at base. And for plants growing with neighbors, potentially being facilitated, we found out that if you set seedling establishment to 0.68% every year, that would give you a stable population growth rate, which is a growth rate of 1. So that's the sort of range that we're talking about for seedling establishment, that when incorporated with the rates that we observed. If you do the same thing for plants growing alone, so not being facilitated, you basically get the same answer. There's no effect that we can see of established plants in terms of facilitation. It doesn't matter whether you're growing alone or growing with other plants. So this kind of goes counter to the idea of facilitation. However, this is completely at odds with what we actually see on the landscape in terms of where do you actually find plants. And we find almost all the plants are associated with neighbors. You don't find that many plants growing alone. Right? So this is the density of plants on the landscape per meter squared. And it's really variable, but by far the highest densities in plots are when plants that are growing in association with other plants versus growing by themselves. And then the fraction of total individuals, almost 90% of the plants in randomly sampled areas are growing with other individuals, not growing alone. Right? So our demographic data says that for established plants, nothing seems to be different about them. They grow and survive and reproduce more or less at the same rate, yet the landscape is totally dominated by plants growing with neighbors. Right? So one way to look at this is to try and simulate these communities with different rates of seedling establishment and say what could possibly what values would explain the communities that we see. This is still pretty early on, but I think the results are sort of so striking that it seems pretty compelling. So what we do is simulate these populations based on the data that we collected. So we have probabilities of survival and growth and reproduction for individual plants. And we create a simulated landscape where we've got clumps of neighboring vegetation, and out in the red is just growing out in the rocks. And then we have different assumptions about seed dispersal, whether it's local or whether seeds can disperse everywhere. We don't really have any information about seed dispersal, but it doesn't look like there's any mechanism for seed dispersal, other than maybe the inflorescence breaking off and being taken by the wind. But when we do this, and we run these simulations, so we can say, all right, well, if seedling establishment, let's say, for plants growing alone was 0.3%, and growing, if a seed lands in habitat with neighbors, let's say it's 2%, this is the outcome of the model. in terms of the density of the plants and the fraction of individuals growing in different microhabitats. The dotted lines represent what we actually see on the landscape. So this is a simulation that's going over 200 years. And granted, we don't see much change because the plants just tend to survive and not grow very much. So it probably does take a long time for things to happen here. But in this case, we would see very few, like the fraction of plants growing with neighbors coming down and the fraction of plants growing alone coming up. We basically would be seeing a landscape that we don't see. And the only way to get an outcome that lines up with what we do see is if seedling establishment for plants growing alone is very, very low, 2 orders of magnitude lower. So this would be 5 out of every 10,000 seeds successfully establishes. Right, so it seems like here that the potential for facilitation is actually very, very high, but it's limited to the establishment phase. Right? And it's kind of unfortunate, though. This is a stage that seems to be really critical, but we almost can't observe it because, at least in these habitats, it's so low. Like, it'd be really challenging to ever observe one of those plants coming up. We have put some seeds out to try and actually do little experiments to see how many plants come up, but we're not holding our breath to get too much data on that. So from this, we can ask the question: well, if we believe this low seedling establishment, what would happen if we didn't have neighboring vegetation? If we only had plants growing in the open spaces and we had no seeds being produced in the habitats with neighbors, and this pretty quickly leads to extinction of the populations. There's no way these populations could be supported without this habitat to recruit new plants into. So it does seem that facilitation is really important for persistence here, but it's a mechanism that's hard to actually observe and has to sort of be inferred from the models. So in summary here, we've got no facilitation of established plants. Seedling establishment must be substantially higher with neighboring vegetation, and that population persistence is really unlikely at this elevation without neighboring vegetation for recruitment. So it does seem pretty critical. But model results indicate that seedling establishment would be really hard to constrain empirically, be hard to observe this. We have no idea actually about dormancy in the species. That could be important. We also don't know whether these plants can have like the degree of competition within the species, how that could limit it. And also for a plant that lives a very, very long time, you know, maybe demography and population dynamics is really driven by rare events, by really important good years where you have lots of seedlings come up. And maybe that only happens every 20 years. So we've got 5 years of data going out there, and maybe we're missing most of it. It's really hard to know in a system like this. So I just want to end with just a few slides on a new study that we're doing. I don't have much to show you because I haven't really done anything yet. But we're focusing on garlic mustard. And I want to just share some of the questions that we're really interested in here. So one is how and to what degree is biotic resistance to invasion, so the ability of a plant community to resist invasion, partitioned along different niche axes for garlic mustard, meaning is there more of an effect of the community on its influence on soil moisture, or how it manipulates pH, et cetera? How does the plant, how does garlic mustard and the other competitors sort of interact along those different axes of resources? And then, is biotic resistance variable across the life cycle of the invading species? And if so, which combination of niche axes life stage is biotic resistance most effective? So we can't always think about garlic mustard as a single plant. A seedling is very different from an adult plant. Right? And so how does the environmental conditions interact with the stage of the life cycle? I'm really interested in the degree of phenotypic plasticity in influencing the niche space. Is on certain niche axes, meaning certain resources, is garlic mustard particularly flexible, and how important is that flexibility and tolerance for its invasion? And then ultimately, how does variation in the environment mediate patterns of coexistence between garlic mustard and the native species that we're going to be using is Impatiens capensis, jewelweed. They coexist and overlap in some habitats, but not fully in their niche space, it seems. So it'd be really interesting to sort of see which sets of environmental conditions lead to different coexistence outcomes. So we've collected seeds from a bunch of different locations around southern New England, and honestly, if any of you know of really good locations that are amenable to research and are not likely to be disturbed or have garlic mustard pulled up in the next few years, please let me know. We would like to potentially add a few more sites. It's amazingly challenging, actually, to find sites and have access to it in New England, all across there. These are students growing plants in the greenhouse to try and get a sense of light and soil moisture. And then I'll just end with this conceptual model. This is sort of what I'm building towards. And getting back to the idea of scaling. So for the most part, this arrow right here is what demography has been. Individuals and then how that translates into the population size. We're starting to do a better job at incorporating environmental drivers. A lot of research are now starting to incorporate density dependence explicitly into models, which we know is important. Work highlighted by the blue arrows here, primarily by Peter Adler and other colleagues. Really amazing work recently that has been, they used this data set from the 1930s, collected I think, by the USDA in Utah. It's just an incredible data set that was sitting in a drawer forever and is now answering some fundamental questions about ecology. But they're looking at the influence of the environment on co-occurring species and how that can then influence individuals and how the population size of one species affects the other. So they're directly incorporating competition into their models and addressing really fundamental questions about coexistence. What I'm really interested in doing is looking to see how the environment actually mediates competition itself. In which environment is one species likely to be the more competitive species, et cetera, and how does that sort of play out in so-called niche space? So I guess this was largely just sort of sharing with you guys a bunch of things that are in my head, thinking about how demography can be used as a tool to go beyond just the population itself. And I think there's a lot of promise there, and there's been in the last 5 years really like a lot of new studies highlighting the questions that can be addressed through these methods. So with that, I want to thank a lot of students who've helped me out and people who are not on this list as well. And I'd be happy to take any questions. So, thank you. Yeah.
On the base plot, could you explain a little bit your introduction? I was curious. So it sounded like you re-inoculated, you put some new seeds, and was there any treatment? Do you know if there was potential survivorship of, you know, they were dormant or so forth?
Well, we put them in different plots.
Okay.
Yeah, so we weren't reinvading the exact same plots. They were sort of adjacent, but most plots were not invadable, by and large. So only in the caged plots, the second year, that's where we saw a lot of population success, but that was the end of the study. So I've gone back since, and there are some pockets where we see plants holding on. But for the most part, it was kind of fortunate in that we weren't sort of contaminating our own study, so to speak. Yeah. Yeah.
I don't know if you can get back to some of your
Sure.
early slide, maybe slide with the correlations, the linear.
Oh, yeah.
and so on.
That one?
Yeah, I just wondered why, you know, on the bottom right, that isn't just an effect of not zooming in further.
The correlation coefficient is 0.01 for this.
Okay.
There's
Yeah, but you're including a lot of what appear to be outliers in that, probably.
Yeah, I think if you even zoom in here, it's a cloud of points.
Okay.
But it's, yeah, I mean, some of them do. The models align very well with the observed growth rates over the time in which they were actually sampled. But it falls apart looking forward in the future.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Curious, in your alpine plots, where you had a very patchy distribution of plants. Do you have a sense if the soil conditions vary?
We are analyzing them soonish. We collected samples. We're going to mainly look at nitrogen and phosphorus, but we can also look at metal concentrations, which probably won't tell us all that much. But for the most part, there's not much. I mean, the key thing that we've noticed in the field is that there's basically no organic matter at all out in the open. If you dig down, you actually do get to some mineral soil, but you have to go quite a bit. But we did dig up some of these plants, and the roots go down. I mean, they're these tiny little plants, but they really dig in. So our metric of biomass, is like the tip of the iceberg too. So it's also, but we can't estimate below ground biomass without killing them. So it's, yeah.
Tying the two together, do you see any herbivory in the alpine?
No, not that I've noticed. No. I'm not sure what, we do see some mammals up there, but I haven't really seen any. Yeah.
When I hear the plants, heavy parasites.
I don't think so. Not that I know of. In those communities, though, there's a bunch of different species up there, and I don't know all the characteristics of those species, but yeah, I'm not sure. But that'd be interesting if you have, this sort of net effect where you potentially do have facilitation, but it's being counterbalanced by negative effects as well. I'm not sure. Yeah.
Do you know the history of those mountain plots, the alpine, like when the glacier moved through there, and how long has that been growing?
Don't exactly know.
I'm just curious.
No, yeah, I'm wondering. I imagine folks at the park would have have information on that. So when was it recolonized, basically?
Yeah, just because I think you used a 200-year scale, and just see how that relates to what's actually, when that likely was recently cleared.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, I imagine it was more than hundreds of years, but I don't know. I mean, it's covered in snow quite a decent amount of the year anyhow. But I mean, so it is possible that you don't have to go back too far before it's. But I could imagine. I don't know, because there's also you go back several thousand years, and it was. We were well out of the ice age then, but glacier again is glacier. So I'm not totally sure, but it is on the southeastern edge of the park. It's really right where the mountains end. You look the other way and you just see the plains going forever. So there may be less glacial activity down there. I'm not sure. Yeah.
Well, how different were your facilitation results in the Christian Kerner's work in the French Alps?
I'm not sure. I'm not sure with that specific study.
He did a number of early papers on facilitation in Alpine.
Was he looking at what do you know what he was specifically measuring?
Well, I mean, roughly it was that in these harsh environments, the more neighbors that they have, the better off they'll be. But I don't know what.
Yeah. Yeah.
If
So
it was by clipped dry weight of biomass.
Right.
Or,
I know work has been
that
done in these in this same area with Ray Calloway at University of Montana, who sort of helped set that location up. So they've done a bunch of work up there as well. So they've looked at, I know they've done work looking at pollinators and other aspects, but not necessarily sort of focusing on population so much. Yeah.
These would probably be 20 or 30-year-old studies. He did a lot of early work in that kind of idea.
Cool. Yeah, I know.
French Alps.
Yeah, I mean, a huge sort of consistent pattern, right, is the fact that you see this flip from lower elevations to higher elevations in terms of when you remove neighbors. That you see competition happening lower down, and then you see the exact opposite effect, and that's sort of observed at different alpine systems all over the world. So maybe his studies were feeding into that.
Another question, if I may, unrelated to that. The herbivories were in the site just north of here.
The base site, yeah.
was there any deer herbivory at all?
No, that's a good question. The site itself is fenced in, because there's a lot of other research happening there. So they fenced it in, not just from deer, but also people. But voles and rabbits are hard to keep out. So we've never observed it, so we're not fully sure what was doing it. It was probably voles or rabbits, but it's frustrating. They would eat the plant and then just, it'd be sitting there. They just bite it like out of spite, and then and they didn't seem to actually get much nutrition out of it. But one thing we did see, actually, and I didn't show it in the results, there occasionally was a positive effect of having neighbors around you on survival, and that was associated with herbivory. So that the idea that plants were being hidden a little bit.
Right.
But it's maybe a bit more anecdotal. I don't know if we could really pull that out.
Did voles ever dig up roots, like root corners?
In one, there's one plot that is consistently a drought area, but it's consistently the driest drought area. And in a dry summer, that area was just thoroughly destroyed. I mean, it was Vole City. Yeah.
So going to that question, when you said other plants around it, you mean other species?
Other species, yep. So
not more of the same plant.
Right. So we clipped all the species that weren't Persicaria around it. Yeah. But I mean, it's we weren't able to therefore remove all the competition because the roots below ground, et cetera. But the effect was pretty strong. And some of that, I'm sure, is light competition too. So it's we're manipulating soil moisture, but that also has influences on nutrient availability and leaching. And by clipping, we're manipulating. I think we can still think about it with respect to resources, but it's not. We can't control one thing without messing it up another one too. So.
I think if we have more questions, maybe we can take them in the next room during refreshment.